This is video lecture number 3 for Science and Law. So we are working our way here through these 3 main components of asking questions in a way that's meaningful to a scientist. So we've already talked about the fact that questions have to be empirical, something we can observe with senses. Second, we've talked about the fact that most empirical science is revolving around trying to find a cause and effect relationship and explain certain things about that. But the last one we're going to talk about now is this third characteristic of asking questions in a manner meaningful to a scientist, and that is measurement. All right, and measurement can be broken down into 3 main components, 3 things we're going to talk about with regard to measurement. And those are these 3 things: variables, operational definition, which we've already mentioned a little bit in class, and then last, reliability and validity of measurement. All right, so starting with variables. Now, the simple definition of a variable is that it's something that a person chooses to measure, in this case, a scientist. And certainly the defining and necessary characteristic of a variable is that whatever it is you're measuring has to have more than one possible value, right? Variables have to vary. There have to be at least 2 possible values in any sort of category of variables. And of course, they can have a limited, an infinite number of values depending on the variable. Now, the Monahan and Walker book does have a discussion of variables, but I particularly like the section in Statistics Without Tears that defines different types of variables. That was in your reading for this lecture, and those are also set forth in a diagram on page 33 of Statistics Without Tears. So I'm basically going to lecture more here from the definitions and breakdown in Statistics Without Tears. So first, we can break down all variables into these 2 main types: category variables and quantity variables. So starting with category variables, we have the very simple definition that category variables involve putting things into categories. Now, sometimes this is just categories that don't denote, for example, that something is better or worse or more or less than something else. Like a simple example is colors. If you have objects categorized by color, and you have the red group and the blue group and the green group, you're really just naming those categories. You aren't saying that any category has more or less of some characteristic that you care about than the other categories. But on the other hand, there are category variables that do give information on the relative position of the categories. And so we're going to talk about those subtypes of category variables in a minute. But the other main type of variables are quantity variables. And with this type, you are definitely categorizing using some characteristic that can be counted or a characteristic that can be measured. So you are assuming here some underlying measurement or counting scale. Okay, first we're going to look at category variables. Now, these can be broken down further into these 2 subtypes. So category variables can be nominal or ordinal. So starting with nominal variables, well, the word nominal comes from the Latin word for name. And nominal variables are just named categories, without one category being better than or more or less than another category. So I do have some examples on the slide for categories you might use if you're describing, say, a sample of people that you're using in some scientific endeavor, things like sex or gender, relationship status, racial or ethnic group, those are going to be considered to be nominal variables. And of course, you can have named categories, nominal categories of objects too, living objects or non-living objects. Now, Statistics Without Tears uses model of bicycle as an example. And of course, you can categorize cars and bicycles by color as well. But this also applies sometimes to living things. We can categorize bacteria by whether they're gram-negative or gram-positive, for example. Those are just nominal categories of bacteria. So that's one kind of category variable, nominal, just named categories. But there are also category variables that are comparative, and those are the ordinal category variables. Now, ordinal variables also divide things into categories, but these are categories that are comparative in that one ordinal category is going to be bigger or better or just possess more or less of a particular characteristic of interest than another ordinal category. All right, so you see on the bottom of the slide, though, that ordinal variables can in fact be further subdivided into two types. They can be ordered categories or they can be ranked. So I want to describe these two types of ordinal variables in a little more detail as Roundtree does in Statistics Without Tears. So with ordered ordinal variables, you're going to have categories that do denote more or less of a characteristic arranged in order. So now a really easy one is to look at things like used cars, categorized by their overall condition, just breaking it down into four main categories, for example, in order from better to worse. So you could have categories like excellent, good, fair, or poor. Now, social science researchers set up quite often broad categories like this too. For example, categories of socioeconomic status, the other example I have on the slide, like maybe upper, middle, or low socioeconomic status. But it should be clear to everybody that all of these ordered categories are going to have to be carefully defined by a researcher in order for them to be really meaningful to anybody that is looking at that data. So a researcher could set up these upper, middle, and lower ordinal categories for something like socioeconomic status, and this would definitely have to be operationally defined by the researcher in detail so that someone looking at the data could know exactly what was being taken into account in assigning someone to a particular category of socioeconomic status. In this case, a particular ordered category, right? And the same applies to ordered categories of condition of used cars, right? The last example I have on the slide, though, would be ranking students by quartile according to their GPAs. So you could be in one of four quartiles of a class of students. This is obviously a simpler one to operationally define because, for example, if you have 100 students in a law school class year, let's say the entire 2L class was only 100 students, now you can divide them into four even quartiles of 25 students, and that's going to be a relative categorization. That's going to be four ordered ordinal categories of students. Now, that's ordered categories, but the other category of ordinal variables involves actually listing every person or car or bicycle in your sample in rank order from best to worst, largest to smallest, and so on. So with ranked variables, you have a lot less lumping together, right? Your items are actually set out in ranked order from best to worst, largest to smallest, so you get much more information than you do with the broader ordered categories. Now, statistics without tiers uses the example of 10 used bicycles that are going to be judged on their relative condition by some definition, right? And then ranked in order from the first in quality to the 10th. And it's easy to use this method with objects or people, including our student rank example. So if you take those same 100 students from the other example that we were originally dividing into just the 4 quartiles, the 4 ordered categories, those same 100 students can be ranked from number 1 to number 100, which of course tells you a lot more than just what quartile each student is in. But even when you are ranking, which does involve some relative judgment, right? One is better or worse than the next one next to it. You still can't make any assumptions, though, about that rank order that would allow you to do any math. For example, you can't assume that the difference in quality between the used cars in your sample that are ranked number 1 and number 2 is the same as the difference between cars ranked number 2 and number 3, right? Because maybe used cars number 1 and number 2 out of your sample of 10 are really in great condition. But then you have a pretty big drop off between 2 and 3, and numbers 3, 4, and 5 are fairly similar. And then another big drop off in quality from numbers 6 through 10. So ranking does give you a way to compare items or people, but they aren't going to necessarily be uniformly distributed along that ranking scale. All right, so those are our category variables. So in contrast, though, to category variables, which aren't quantified, quantity variables do allow us to assign numerical values to variables. And this type of variable also has a couple of subtypes. It can be broken further down into either discrete quantity variables or continuous quantity variables. Statistics Without Tiers has a great explanation of this too. So discrete quantity variables have a clear separation between them, like number of children in a family. Let's say you're polling a sample of families, asking how many children they have. The answers are going to be obviously discrete numbers, separated by exactly 1. So even though after you're all done gathering your data, you might then calculate the mean or average family size. Now that number might end up being something like 2.6 children, right? But the actual variables that go into that calculation are obviously 1, 2, 3, and so on. So those are going to be discrete numbers, discrete quantity variables. And the other example I have on the slide, the same applies to things like money, income, for example, or prices, if that's information you're gathering for your research. Now, with American money, the smallest discrete variable you can have is the penny, 1 cent. So something can cost 25 cents or 26 cents, but not 25.5 cents, right? So again, an example of discrete variables. Now, in contrast, though, continuous variables just fall on a sliding scale with an infinite number of possible variables in between. Height is an example of that. You can be 5'7" tall, or 5'7" and 1/3 inches, or 5'7" and 5/6 inches, and so on. I mean, really, the same applies with age or weight too. You're only limited there in terms of how many variables you can have by the sensitivity of your measuring equipment. And here is the chart from page 33 of Statistics Without Tiers, showing all these different categories of variables. And in terms of the relevance of this to the class going forward, we're going to see that statistical calculations can be done with either category or quantity variables, although most of what we're going to be looking at involves quantity variables. So I really just want you to have this general sense of these And of course, these are going to be a great thing to test on for the exam. This would make a great multiple choice question, for example. Now, though, I have to talk about another way of categorizing variables that applies in research design. These are very important for you to be able to distinguish. So these categories are referred to as dependent variables or independent variables. So in designing or evaluating research, it's really critical to understand the distinction between these. One quick way to remember these is to say, well, the independent variable is the one I, as a scientist, think might be the cause of something. So I stands for I in and I for independent. And the dependent variable is that something that I think the independent variable might be affecting. So the dependent variable is the effect in which you are interested as a scientist. Another way of talking about dependent variables is to call those the measurement outcome. So let's say you are a researcher and you want to study about the effect of altering the size of a jury in civil cases. So in this kind of study, looking at how jury size might affect some particular jury deliberation outcome, which could be anything like the amount of damages awarded by mock juries, or even the amount of time a jury spent deliberating. How are those things affected by the size of the jury? Now, in those examples, the deliberation outcome, for example, or the amount of damages awarded, those are going to be dependent variables. And obviously, the independent variable in a research study like that is the factor you as the researcher are trying to understand and whose effect you are going to observe on the dependent variable. So in this example, jury size is going to be your independent variable. I, as the scientist, I want to study effective jury size. I'm controlling that in my study. So, for example, a very common comparison used in jury size research is the difference between 6 and 12 member juries. So if you are doing that, you're probably going to present different sized mock juries, some 6-member mock juries and some 12-member mock juries, the exact same case. And you want to keep all the other variables as stable as possible. And then you measure how those different jury sizes affected the thing you're curious about, whatever your dependent variable is. So another example, if you wanted, for example, to study the effect of obscene material on violence, the obscene material or the exposure to that material would be the independent variable. And of course, however you define violence, that's going to be the dependent one. Now, I think it's easy to see that's going to be a lot more complicated research project than the simple jury size example I just gave, because you're going to have to carefully operationally define everything and decide how that could be measured. You have to define, for example, what constitutes obscene material, and certainly you have to define how you're going to measure violence and how that obscene material might be affecting levels of violence. All right, so you as the scientist, you might have all of your ducks in a row. You have your dependent and independent variables all well defined, and that's really great. But very often, you as a scientist might have to deal with the potential that what is called a confounding variable is going to mediate or alter your results, or at least has the potential to have altered the effect of your independent variable on the dependent variable. So that's going to be a risk, right? Because then whatever effect you're seeing on your dependent variable might not have been caused just by your independent variable you set out to test, or it might not have been completely caused by your alteration in your independent variable. So, for example, in Monahan and Walker, they use that example of a prison treatment program and that program's effect on the dependent variable of recidivism among released prisoners. So you might do a study on a prison treatment program and find that in fact younger prisoners who participated in that program did have a reduced recidivism rate as compared to younger prisoners who did not go through the program. But you might find that those differences don't apply to older prisoners who did and did not go through the program. So here, what are all of our variables? Well, the treatment program is going to be the independent variable, and recidivism rate is going to be the dependent variable you're interested in, but age is going to be a potential confounding variable there, and that is going to affect the possible validity of your results. Now, in this prison treatment example, if you had large enough samples in your groups of prisoners, you could possibly break down your data by age categories and still end up with statistically significant and meaningful results for some age categories. And the last thing I have on this slide is that confounding variables can be further defined as either extraneous or intervening. Now, I don't want to get into that very deeply, but generally researchers can more easily predict and control for extraneous confounding variables. So in the prison example, age, that's going to be an extraneous variable that hopefully the researchers would anticipate and try to control for. And it's probably, in fact, age is probably one of the things a researcher working in this area would, in fact, anticipate, because there are a lot of existing data out there indicating that as people age, they do tend to commit fewer crimes. So if you're studying recidivism, you're probably going to anticipate that age could matter a great deal in that research, that it could be an extraneous confounding variable that you have to think about when you're designing your research. On the other hand, examples of intervening variables, those are things that just come up during the course of the research that are difficult or impossible to anticipate or control for. Things that just happen as you carry on your research, like subject fatigue, for example, or motivational problems in your subjects. So those are going to be intervening confounding variables that are really going to be very hard to anticipate or control for. You're just going to have to discuss those intervening variables when you report your data or your results. Okay, this is the end of video lecture number 3.